became the National Socialist Workers' Party, from which the abbreviated name Nazi emerged. Hitler left the army for good. Henceforth, he would devote all of his time to the Nazi Party, from which neither then nor later did he accept any salary. How, then, it might be asked, did Hitler live? His fellow party workers themselves sometimes wondered. In the indictment, which the rebel members of the party committee drew up in July 1921, the question was bluntly posed. If any member asks him how he lives and what his former profession was, he merely becomes angry and excited. Up to now, no answer has been supplied to these questions. So, his consciousness cannot be clean, especially as his excessive intercourse with ladies, to whom he often describes himself as the King of Munich, costs a great deal of money. Hitler answered the question during the subsequent libel action which he brought against the authors of the pamphlet. To the question of the court as to exactly how he lived, he replied, "If I speak for the National Socialist Party, I take no money for myself, but I also speak for other organizations. And then, of course, I accept a fee. I also have my midday meal with various party comrades in turn. I am further assisted to a modest extent by a few party comrades." Probably this was very close to the truth. Such well-heeled friends as Dietrich Eckart, Göring, would undoubtedly lend him money to pay his rent, purchase clothes, and buy a meal. His wants were certainly modest. Until 1929, he occupied a two-room flat in a lower middle-class district near the river Isar. In the winter, he wore an old trench coat. It later became familiar to everyone in Germany from numerous photographs. In the summer, he often appeared in shorts, the lederhosen, which most Bavarians donned in seasonable weather. In 1923, Eckhart and Isar stumbled upon Platerhof in an inn near Birchhagen as a summer retreat for Hitler and friends. Hitler fell in love with the lovely mountain country. It was here that he later built the spacious villa Berghof, which would be his home and where he would spend much of his time until the later war years. There was, however, little time for rest and recreation in the stormy years between 1921 and 23. There was a party to build, and to keep control of the face of jealous rivals as unscrupulous as himself. The NSDAP was but one of several right-wing movements in Bavaria struggling for public attention and support, and beyond, in the rest of Germany, there were many others. There was a dizzy succession of events and of constantly changing situations for a politician to watch, to evaluate, to take advantage of. In April 1921, the Allies had presented Germany the Bill of Reparations, a whopping 132 billion gold marks, $33 billion, which the Germans howled they could not possibly pay. The mark, normally valued at 4 to the dollar, had begun to fall. By the summer of 1921, it had dropped to 75. A year later, to 400 to the dollar. The shaky national government in Berlin finally answered the challenge with a special law for the protection of the Republic, which imposed severe penalties for political terrorism. Berlin demanded the dissolution of the innumerable armed leagues and the end of political gangsterism. The Bavarian government, even under the moderate Count Lichtenfeld, who had replaced the extremist Kerr in 1921, was finding it difficult to go along with the national regime in Berlin. When it attempted to enforce the law against terrorism, the Bavarian rightists, of whom Hitler was now one of the acknowledged young leaders, organized a conspiracy to overthrow Lichterfeld and march in Berlin to bring down the Republic. The fledgling democratic Weimar Republic was in deep trouble, as its existence constantly threatened not only from the extreme right, but from the extreme left. To most men in the victorious Allied lands of the West, the proclamation of the Republic in Berlin on November 9th, 1918, had appeared to mark the dawn of a new day for the German people and their nation. Woodrow Wilson, in exchange of notes which had led to the armistice, had pressed for the abolition of a militarist autocracy, and the Germans seemingly obliged him. Although reluctantly, the Kaiser had been forced to abdicate and flee. The monarchy was dissolved, and all the dynasties in Germany were quickly done away with, and the German government was proclaimed, but proclaimed by accident. On the afternoon of November 9th, the so-called majority Social Democrats, under the leadership of Friedrich Ebert and Philipp Schneidheim, met in the Reichstag in Berlin following the resignation of the Chancellor, Prince Max of Baden. They were sorely puzzled as to what to do. Prince Max had just announced the abdication of the Kaiser. Ebert, a saddler by trade, had thought that one of Wilhelm's sons, anyone except the dissolute Crown Prince, might succeed him, for he favored a constitutional monarchy on which the British pattern was created. Ebert, though, led by the socialists, abhorred social revolution. "I hate it like sin," he had once declared. But revolution was in the air in Berlin. The capital was paralyzed by a general strike. Down the broad Unter der Linden, a few blocks from the Reichstag, the Spartakists, led by left socialists Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were preparing from their citadel in the Kaiser's palaces to proclaim a Soviet republic. When word of this reached the socialists in the Reichstag, they were consternated. Something had to be done at once to forestall the Spartakists. Schneemann thought of something. Without consulting his comrades, he dashed to the window overlooking the Königsplatz, where a great throng had gathered, stuck his head out, and, on his own, as if the idea had just popped in his head, proclaimed the Republic. The saddlemaker Ebert was furious. He had hoped somehow to save the monarchy. Thus was the German Republic born by, as if by a fluke. The socialists themselves were not staunch Republicans. It could be hardly expected that the conservatives would be, but the latter had abdicated their responsibility. They and the army leaders, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, had pushed political power into the hands of the reluctant Social Democrats. In doing so, they had managed also to place on the shoulders of these democratic working-class leaders apparent responsibility for signing the surrender and ultimately the peace treaty, thus laying on them the blame for Germany's defeat and for whatever suffering a lost war and a dictated peace might bring upon the German people. This was a shabby trick, one which the merest child would be expected to see through. But in Germany it worked. It doomed the Republic from the start. Perhaps it need not have. In November 1918, the Social Democrats, holding absolute power, might have quickly laid the foundation of a lasting democratic republic. But to have done so, they would have had to suppress permanently, or at least curb permanently, the forces which had propped up the empire, and which would not loyally accept a democratic Germany. The feudal junker landlords and other upper castes the magnates who ruled over the great industrial cartels, the other roving confederati of Free Corps, the ranking officials of the Imperial Civil Service, and above all, the military caste and members of the General Staff. They would have had to break up many of the great estates, which were wasteful and uneconomic, and the industrial monopolies and cartels, and clean out the bureaucracy, the judiciary, the police, the universities, and the army of all who were not loyal and honest. This, the Social Democrats, who were loyal and most well-meaning trade unionists, with the same habit of bowing to old, established authority, which is ingrained in Germans of other classes, would not bring themselves to do. Instead, they began abdicating their authority to the force which had always been dominant in modern Germany, the army, for which it had been defeated on the battlefield. The army still had hopes of maintaining itself at home and of defeating the revolution. To achieve these ends, it moved swiftly and boldly. On the night of November 9th, 1918, a few hours after the Republic had been proclaimed, a telephone rang in the study of Ebert, the Reich Chancellor in Berlin. It was a very special telephone, for it was linked with the Supreme Headquarters at Spa by a private and secret line. Ebert was alone. He picked up the telephone. "Gardner speaking," a voice said. The former saddle maker, still bewildered by the day's events, which had suddenly thrust into his unwilling hands whatever political power remained in a crumbling Germany, was impressed. General Wilhelm Groener was a successor of Ludendorff as first quartermaster general. Earlier on that very day at Spa, it was he who, when Field Marshal von Hindenburg faltered, had bluntly informed the Kaiser that he no longer commanded the loyalty of his troops, and must go, a brave act for which the military caste never forgave him. Ebert and Groener had developed a bond of mutual respect since 1916, when the general, then in charge of war production, had worked closely with the socialist leader. Early in November, a few days before, they had conferred in Berlin on how to save the monarchy and the fatherland. Now, at the fatherland's lowest moment, a secret telephone line brought them together. Then and there, socialist leader and the second in command of the German army made a pact, which, though it would not be publicly known for years, was to determine the nation's fate. Ebert agreed to put down anarchy and Bolshevism and maintain the army with all of its tradition. Groener thereupon pledged the support of the army in helping the new government establish itself and carry out its aims. "Will the Field Marshal retain the command?" Ebert asked. General Groener replied that he would. "Convey to the Field Marshal the thanks of the government," Ebert replied. The German army was saved, but the Republic, on the very day of its birth, was lost. The generals, with the honorable exception of Groener himself, and but a few others, would never serve it loyally. In the end, led by Hindenburg, they betrayed it to the Nazis. At the very moment, to be sure, the specter of what had just happened in Russia haunted the minds of Ebert and his fellow socialists. They did not want to become the German Kerenskys. They didn't want to be supplanted by Bolshevists. Everywhere in Germany, the soldiers and workers' councils were springing up and assuming power, as they had done in Russia. It was these groups which on November 10th elected a council of people's representatives, with Ebert as its head, to govern Germany for the time being. In December, the first Soviet Congress of Germany met in Berlin, composed of delegates from the soldiers and workers' councils throughout the country. It demanded the dismissal of Hindenburg, the abolition of the regular army, and the substitution of a civil guard, whose officers would be elected by the men and which would be under the supreme authority of the council. This was too much for Hindenburg and Groener. They declined to recognize the authority of the Soviet Congress. Ebert himself did nothing to carry out his demands. But the army, fighting for its life, demanded more positive action from the government that it agreed to support. 2 days before Christmas, the People's Marine Division, now under control of the communist Spartakists, occupied the Wilhelmstrasse, broke into the chancellery, and cut its telephone wires. The secret line to the army headquarters, however, continued to function, and over it, Ebert appealed for help. The army promised liberation by the Potsdam garrison, but before it could arrive, the mutinous sailors retired to their quarters in the stables of the Imperial Palace, which the Spartakists still held. The Spartakists, with Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, the two most effective agitators in Germany, at their head, continued to push for a Soviet Republic. Their armed power in Berlin was mounting. On Christmas Eve, the Marine Division had easily repulsed an attempt by regular troops from Potsdam to dislodge it from the Imperial stables. Hindenburg and Groener pressed Ebert to honor the pact between them and to suppress the Bolshevists. This, the socialist leader, was only too glad to do. 2 days after Christmas, he appointed Gustav Noske as Minister of National Defense, and from this appointment, events proceeded with a logic which all knew too well. Noske was a master butcher by trade, who had worked his way up in the trade union movement and the Social Democratic Party, becoming a member of the Reichstag in 1906, where he became recognized as the party's expert on military affairs. He also became recognized as a strong nationalist and a strongman. Prince Max of Baden had picked him up to put him down. A stocky, square-jawed man of great physical strength and energy through... Okay, he's a strong guy. He's a big guy. He's a big fella. Early in January 1919, he struck, between January 10th and 17th, Bloody Week, as it was called in Berlin for a long time. Regular and Free Corps troops, under the direction of Noske and the command of General Leuckwitz, crushed the Spartakists. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were captured and murdered by officers of the Guard Cavalry Division. As soon as the fighting in Berlin was over, elections were held throughout Germany for the National Assembly, which was to draw up a new constitution. The voting, which took place on January 19, 1919, revealed that the middle and upper classes had regained some of their courage in the little more than 2 months which had elapsed since the revolution. The Social Democrats, who had governed alone because no other group would share this burden, received 13 million votes out of the 30 million votes cast, and won 185 out of 421 seats in the assembly. But this was considerably less than a majority. Obviously, the new Germany was not going to be built by the working class alone. 2 middle-class parties, the center representing the political movement of the Roman Catholic Church, and the Democratic Party, born of a fusion in December of the old Progressive Party, and the left wing of the National Liberals, polled 11 million votes between them and obtained 166 seats in the Assembly. Both parties professed support for a moderate democratic republic, though there was a considerable sentiment for an eventual restoration of the monarchy. The Conservatives, some of whose leaders had gone into hiding in November, and others who, like Count von Westarp, had appealed to Ebert for protection, showed that through reduced numbers, they were still far from extinguished. Rechristened the German National People's Party, they polled over 3 million votes and elected 44 deputies. Their right-wing allies, the National Liberals, who had changed their name to the German People's Party, received nearly 1.5 million votes and won 19 seats. Though decidedly in the minority, the two conservative parties had won enough seats in the assembly to be vocal. Indeed, no sooner had the assembly met in Weimar on February 6, 1919, that the leaders of these groups had sprang up to defend the name of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the way he and his generals had conducted the war. Gustav Stresemann, the head of the People's Party, had not yet experienced what later seemed to many to be a change of heart and mind. In 1919 he was still known as the man who had to be the supreme command mouthpiece of the Reichstag. Ludendorff's young man, as he was called, a violent supporter of the party of annexation, a fanatic of unrestricted submarine warfare. The Constitution, which emerged from the Assembly after 6 months of debate, was, on paper, the most liberal and democratic document of its kind the 20th century had ever seen. Mechanically, well nigh perfect, full of ingenious and admirable devices, which seemed to guarantee the working of an almost flawless democracy. The ideal cabinet of government was borrowed from England and France, of a strong popular president from the United States, of the referendum from Switzerland. An elaborate and complicated system of proportional representation and voting by lists was established in order to prevent the wasting of votes and give small minorities a right to be represented in Parliament. The wording of the Weimar Constitution was sweet and eloquent to the ear of any democratically minded man. The people were declared sovereign. Political power emanates from the people. Men and women were given the vote at the age of 20. All Germans are equal before the law. Personal liberty is inviolable. Every German has a right to form associations or societies. All inhabitants of the Reich enjoy complete liberty, of freedom and consequence. No man in the world would be more free than a German. No government more democratic and liberal than his. On paper, at least. Before the drafting of the Weimar Constitution was finished, an inevitable event had occurred which cast a spell of doom over it and the republic which it was to establish. This was the drawing up of the Treaty of Versailles. During the first chaotic and riotous days of peace, and even after the deliberations of the National Assembly got underway in the Weimar, the German people seemed to give little thought to the consequences of their defeat. Or if they did, they appeared to be smugly confident that having, as the Allies urged, got rid of the Bolsheviks and set about forming a democratic republic government, they were entitled to a just peace, which was not on their having lost the war, but on President Wilson's celebrated 14 points. German memories did not appear to stretch back as far as 1 year, to March 3rd, 1918, when the then victorious German Supreme Command had imposed on a defeated Russia at Brest-Litovsk a peace treaty, which, to a British historian writing 2 decades later, the passions of war had cooled, was a humiliation without precedent or equal in modern history. It deprived Russia of a territory nearly as large as Austria-Hungary and Turkey combined, with 56 million inhabitants, or 32% of her whole population, a third of her railway mileage, 73% of her total iron ore, 89% of her total coal production, and more than 5,000 factories and industrial plants. Moreover, Russia was obliged to pay Germany an indemnity of 6 billion marks. The day of reckoning arrived for the Germans in the late spring of 1919. The terms of the Versailles Treaty, laid down by the Allies without negotiation with Germany, were pushed in Berlin May 7th. They came as a staggering blow to a people who had insisted on deluding themselves throughout the country to protest against the treaty and to demand that Germany refuse to sign it. Schneidmann, who had become chancellor during the Weimar Assembly, cried, "May the handwriter who signs this treaty during the Weimar... Oh. May the handwriter that signs this treaty..." On May 8th, Ebert, who had become provisional president, and the government publicly branded the terms as unreasonable and unbearable. The next day, the German delegation at Versailles wrote that such a treaty was intolerable for any nation. What was so intolerable about it? It restored at least Lorraine to France, a parcel of territory to Belgium, a similar parcel in Schleswig to Denmark. It gave back to the Poles the land some of them only... This was one of the stipulations which had infuriated the Germans the most, not only because they resented separating East Prussia from the fatherland by a corridor which gave Poland access to the sea, but because they despised the Poles, whom they considered an inferior race. Scarcely less infuriating to the Germans was that the treaty forced them to accept responsibility for starting the war and demanding that they turn over to the Allies Kaiser Wilhelm II and some 800 other war criminals. Reparations were to be fixed later, but a first payment of $5 billion in gold marks was to be paid between 1919 and 1921, and certain deliveries in kind, coal, ships, lumber, cattle, etc., were to be made in lieu of cash reparations. But what hurt most was that Versailles virtually disarmed Germany, and thus, for the time being anyway, barred the way for German hegemony in Europe. And yet, the hated Treaty of Versailles, unlike that which Germany had imposed on Russia, left the Reich geographically and economically largely intact and preserved her political unity and her potential strength as a great nation. The provisional government at Weimar, with the exception of Erzberger, who urged acceptance of the treaty on the grounds that its terms be easily evaded, was strongly against accepting the Versailles Diktat, as it was now being called. Behind the government stood the overwhelming majority of citizens, from left to right. And the army? If the treaty were to be rejected, could the army resist an inevitable Allied attack from the west? Ebert put it up to the Supreme Command, from which had now moved its headquarters to Kolberg and Pomeria. On June 17th, Field Marshal von Hindenburg, prodded by General Groener, who had saw that German military resistance would be futile, replied, "In the event of the reassumption of hostilities, we can reconquer the province of Posen and defend our frontiers in the west. However, part of the enemy, in view of the numerical superiority of the Entente and the ability to outflank us on both wings, the success of the operation as a whole, it is therefore undoubtful to fail. But, as a soldier, I cannot help feeling that it were better to perish honorably than accept a disgraceful peace." The concluding words of the revered Commander-in-Chief were in the best German military tradition, but their sincerity may be judged by knowledge of the fact that the German people were unaware of that Hindenburg had agreed with Groener to try to resist the Allies. The Allies were now demanding a definite answer from Germany. On June 16th, the day previous to Hindenburg's written answer to Ebert, they had given the Germans an ultimatum. Either the treaty must be accepted by June 24th, or the armistice agreement would be terminated by the Allied powers. Once again, Ebert appealed to Groener. If the Supreme Command thought there was the slightest possibility of successful military resistance of the Allies, Ebert promised to try to secure the rejection of the treaty by the Assembly. But he must have an answer immediately. The last day of the ultimatum, June 24th, had arrived. The cabinet meeting at 4:30 p.m. to make this final decision. Once more, Hindenburg and Groener conferred. You know, as well as I do, that armed resistance is impossible, the aging, worn field marshal had said. But once again, as at Spa, on November 9th, 1918, when he could not bring himself to tell the Kaiser the truth and left the unpleasant duty to Groener, he declined to tell the truth to the provisional president of the Republic. You can give the answer to the president as well as I can, he had said to Groener. And again, the courageous general took the final responsibility, which belonged to the field marshal, though he must have known that it would eventually make doubly sure his being made a scapegoat for the officer corps. He telephoned the Supreme Command's view of the president. Relieved at having the army's leaders take responsibility, a fact which was soon forgotten in Germany, the National Assembly approved the signing of the peace treaty by a large majority, and its decision was communicated to Klinsmann a bare 19 minutes before the Allied ultimatum ran out. 4 days later, on June 18, 1919, the peace treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. From that day on, Germany became a house divided. The conservatives would accept neither the Treaty of Peace nor the Republic which it ratified, nor in the long run would the army. General Groener accepted. Though it had sworn to support the democratic regime, it had itself made the final decision to sign it at Versailles. Despite the November Revolution, the conservatives still held the economic power. They owned the industries, the large estates, and most of the country's capital. Their wealth could be used, and was, to subsidize the political parties and the political press that would strive from now on to undermine the Republic. The army began to circumvent the military restrictions of the peace treaty before the ink on it was scarcely dry, and thanks to the timidity and short-sightedness of the socialist leaders, the officer corps managed not only to maintain the army in its old Prussian traditions, as we have seen, but to become the real center of political power in a new Germany. The army did not, until the last days of the short-lived republic, stake its fortunes on any one political movement. But under General Hans von Seeckt, the brilliant creator of the 100,000-man Reichswehr, the army, small as it was in numbers, became a state within a state, exerting an increasing influence on the nation's foreign and domestic policies, until a point was reached where the Republic's continued existence depended on the will of the officer corps. As a state within a state, it maintained its independence of the national government. Under the Weimar Constitution, the army could not have been subordinated to the cabinet and parliament, as the army establishments of the other Western democracies were. But it was not. Nor was the officer corps purged of its monarchist, anti-republican frame of mind. A new officer corps was not necessary. They saw the danger of handing the army back to officers of the old authoritarian imperialist tradition. But they were successfully opposed, not only by the generals, but of their fellow socialists, led by Minister of Defense Noske. This proletarian minister of the Republic openly boasted that he wanted to revive the proud soldier memories of the First World War. The failure of the duty by the elected government to build a new army that would be faithful to its own democratic spirit and subordinate to the cabinet of the Reichstag was a fatal mistake for the Republic, as time would tell. The failure to clean out the judiciary was another. The administrators of the law became one of the centers of the counter-revolution, preventing justice for reactionary political ends. It is impossible to escape the conclusion, the historian Franz L. Neumann declared, that political justice is the blackest page in the life of the German Republic. After the Kapp Putsch in 1920, the government charged 705 persons with high treason. Only one, the police president of Berlin, received assistance. 5 years of honorary confinement. When the state of Prussia withdrew his pension, the Supreme Court ordered it restored. A German court, in December 1926, awarded General von Lüttwitz, the military leader of the Kapp Putsch, back payment of his pension to cover the period when he was a rebel against the government, and also the 5 years when he was a fugitive from justice in Hungary. Yet, hundreds of German liberals were sentenced to long prison terms and charges of treason because they revealed or denounced in the press or by speech the army's constant violations of the Versailles Treaty. The treason laws were ruthlessly applied to the supporters of the Republic. Those on the right who tried to overthrow it, as Adolf Hitler was soon to learn, got off either free or with the lightest of sentences. Even the assassins, if they were of the right and their victims Democrats, were leniently treated by the courts or, as often happened, helped to escape from the custody of the courts by army officers. And so, the mild socialists, aided by the Democrats and the Catholic centrists, were left to carry on the Republic, which tottered on from its birth. They bore the hatred, the abuse, and sometimes the bullets of their opponents, who grew in number and resolve. In the heart of the people, cried Oswald Spengler, who had skyrocketed to fame with his book, The Decline of the West, the Weimar Constitution is already doomed. Down in Bavaria, the young firebrand Adolf Hitler grasped the strength of the new nationalist, anti-democratic, anti-republican tide. He began to ride it. He was greatly aided by the course of events, two in particular, the fall of the Mark and the French occupation of the Ruhr. The Mark, as we have seen, had began to slide in 1921, when it dropped to 75 to the dollar. The next year, it fell to 400, and by the beginning of 1923 to 7,000. Already in the fall of 1922, the German government had asked the Allies to grant a momentarian of reparation payments. This the French government bluntly refused. When Germany defaulted in deliveries of timber, the hard-handed French premier, who had been the wartime president of France, ordered French troops to occupy the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, which, after the loss of Upper Silesia to Poland, furnished the Reich with 4/5 of its coal and steel production. This paralyzing blow to Germany's economy united the people momentarily, as they had not been since 1914. The workers of the Ruhr declared a general strike and received financial support from the government in Berlin, which called for a campaign of massive resistance. With the help of the army, sabotage and guerrilla warfare were organized. The French countered with arrests, deportations, and death sentences. But not a wheel, and the Ruhr turned. The strangulation of Germany's economy hastened in the final plunge of the Mark. On the occupation of the Ruhr, on January 1923, it fell to 18,000 to the dollar. By July 1st, it had dropped to 160,000. To August 1st, to 1,000,000. By November, when Hitler thought his hour had struck, it took 4 billion marks to buy a dollar. And thereafter, the figures became trillions. German currency had become utterly worthless. Purchasing power of salaries and wages was reduced to zero. The living savings of the middle class and working class were wiped out. But something even more important was destroyed. The faith of the people in the economic structure of Germany. What good were the standards and practices of such a society, which encouraged savings and investment, and solely promised a safe return from them? And was this not the Democratic Republic, which had surrendered to the enemy and had accepted the burden of reparations? Unfortunately for its survival, the Republic did not bear responsibility. The inflation could have been halted by merely balancing out the budget, a difficult but not impossible feat. Inadequate taxation might have achieved this. Adequate taxation. But the government did not dare to tax adequately. After all, the cost of the war, 164 billion marks, had been met not even in part by direct taxation, but by 93 billions of it by war loans, 29 billions out of treasury bills, and the rest by increasing the issue of paper money. Instead of drastically raising taxes on those who could pay, the Republican government actually reduced them in 1921. From then on, goaded by big industrialists and landlords who stood to gain through the masses of people, were financially ruined. The government deliberately let the mark tumble in order to free the state of its public debts, to escape from paying reparations, and to sabotage the French in the war. Moreover, the destruction of the currency enabled Germany to take its heavy industry and wipe out its indebtedness by refunding its obligations in worthless marks. The General Staff, disguised as the Office of Troops, to evade the peace treaty, with which supposedly had outlawed it, took notice that the fall of the mark wiped out the war debts, and thus left Germany financially unencumbered for a new war. The masses of the people, however, did not realize how much the industrial tycoons, the army, and the state were benefiting from the ruin of the currency. All they knew was that a large bank account could not buy a straggly bunch of carrots, a half peck of potatoes, a few ounces of sugar, a pound of flour. They knew that as individuals, they were bankrupt. And they knew hunger when it gnawed at them, as it did daily. In their misery and hopelessness, they made the Republic the scapegoat for all that had happened. Such times were haven sent for Adolf Hitler. The government calmly goes on printing these scraps of paper because if it stopped, that would be the end of the government, he cried. Because once the printing press is stopped, and that is the prerequisite for the stabilization of the mark, the swindle would at once be brought to light. Believe me, our misery will increase. The scoundrel will get by. The reason? because the state itself has become the biggest swindler and crook, a robber state. If the horrified people notice that they can starve on billions, they must arrive at this conclusion. We will no longer submit to a state which is built on the swindling idea of the majority. We want a dictatorship. No doubt the hardships and uncertainties of the wanton inflation were driving millions of Germans towards the conclusion, and Hitler was ready to lead them on. In fact, he had begun to believe that the chaotic conditions of 1923 had created an opportunity to throw the Republic, which might not reoccur. But certain difficulties lay in his way if he were himself to lead the counter-revolution, and he was not much interested in it. Unless he was. In the first place, the Nazi Party, though it was growing daily in numbers, was far from being even the most important political movement in Bavaria, and outside the state it was unknown. How could such a small party overthrow the Republic? Hitler, who was not easily discouraged by odds against him, thought he saw a way. He might unite, under his leadership, all the anti-Republican national forces in Bavaria. Then, with the support of the Bavarian government, the armed leagues, and the Reichswehr stationed in Bavaria, he might lead a march on Berlin, as Mussolini had marched on Rome the year before, and bring the Weimar Republic down. Obviously, Mussolini's easy success had given him food for thought. The German occupation of the Ruhr, though it brought a renewal of German hatred for the traditional enemy, and thus revived the spirit of nationalism, complicated Hitler's task. It had begun to unify the German people behind the Republican government in Berlin, which had chosen to defy France. This was the last thing Hitler wanted. His aim was to do away with the Republic. France had to be taken care of after Germany had its nationalist revolution and established a dictatorship. Against a strong current of public opinion, Hitler dared to take an unpopular line. No, not down with France, but down with the traitors of the fatherland. Down with the November criminals. That must be our slogan. All through the first months of 1923, Hitler dedicated himself to making the slogan effective. In February, due largely to the organizational tenets of Rome, 4 of the armed patriotic leagues of Bavaria joined with the Nazis to form the so-called Working Union of the Fatherland Fighting Leagues, under the political leadership of Hitler. In September, an even stronger group was established under the name German Fighting Union, with Hitler one of a triumvirate of leaders. This organization sprang from a great meeting held at Nuremberg on September 2nd to celebrate the anniversary of the German defeat of France at Sedan in 1870. Most of the fascist-minded groups in southern Germany were represented, and Hitler received something of an ovation after a violent speech against the national government. The objectives of the new Kampfbund were openly stated: to overthrow the Republic and the tearing up of the Treaty of Versailles. At the Nuremberg meeting, Hitler had stood in the reviewing stand next to General Ludendorff during a parade of the demonstrators. This was not by accident. For some time, the young Nazi chief had been cultivating the war hero, who had lent his famous name to the makers of the Kapp Putsch in Berlin, and who since continued to encourage counter-revolution from the right, might be tempted to back an action which was beginning to germinate in Hitler's mind. The old general had no political sense. Living now outside Munich, he did not disguise his contempt for Bavarians, for Crown Prince Ruprecht, the Bavarian pretender, and the Catholic Church, and his most Catholic of all states in Germany. He did not want Ludendorff as the political leader of the nationalist counter-revolution, a role which it was known by the war hero was ambitious to assume. Hitler insisted on that role for himself, but Ludendorff's name, his renown in the officer corps and among the conservatives throughout Germany, would be an asset to a provincial politician, still largely unknown outside Bavaria. Hitler began to include Ludendorff in his plans. In the fall of 1923, the German Republic and the state of Bavaria reached the point of crisis. On September 26, Gustav Stresemann, the Chancellor, announced the end of a passive resistance in the Ruhr and the resumption of German reparation payments. This former mouthpiece of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, a staunch conservative at heart, a monarchist, had come to the conclusion that if Germany were to be saved, united, and made strong again, it must, at least for the time being, accept the Republic, come to terms with the Allies, and obtain a period of tranquility in which it must gain economic strength. To drift any further would only end in civil war, and perhaps the final destruction of the nation. The abandonment of resistance to the French in the Ruhr and the resumption of the burden of reparations touched off an outburst of anger and hysteria among the German nationalists and the communists, who had been growing in strength. Stresemann was faced with a serious revolt from both extreme right and left. He had anticipated it by having President Ebert declare a state of emergency on the very day he announced the change of policy on the Ruhr reparations. From September 26, 1923 and February 1924, executive power in Germany under the Emergency Act was placed in the hands of the Minister of Defense, Otto Giesler, and the commander of the army, General von Seeckt. In reality, this made the general of the army virtual dictators of the Reich. Bavaria was in no mood to accept such a solution. The Bavarian cabinet of Eugen von Kneiling proclaimed its own state of emergency on September 26th and named the right-wing monarchist and former president Gustav von Kahr as state commissioner with dictatorial powers. In Berlin, it was feared that Bavaria might secede from the Reich, restore the monarchy, and perhaps form a South German union with Austria. A meeting of the cabinet was hastily summoned by President Ebert, and General von Seeckt was invited to attend. Ebert wanted to know where the army stood. Seeckt bluntly told him, "The army, Mr. President, stands behind me." The icy words pronounced by the monocled, poker-faced Prussian commander-in-chief did not, as might be expected, dismay the German president or his chancellor. They had already recognized the army's position as a state within the state, and subject only to itself. 3 years before, as we have seen, when the Kapp forces occupied Berlin and a similar appeal had been made to Seeckt, the army had stood, not behind the Republic, but behind the general. The only question now, in 1923, was where Seeckt stood. Fortunately for the Republic, he now chose to stand behind it, not because he believed in Republican democratic principles, but because he saw that for the moment, the support of the existing regime was necessary for the preservation of the army, itself threatened by revolt in Bavaria, and in the north, for saving Germany from a disastrous civil war. Seeckt knew some of the leading officers of the army division in Munich were siding with the Bavarian separatists. He knew of a conspiracy of the Black Reichswehr under Major Bruckbrucker, a former general staff officer, to occupy Berlin and turn the Republican government out. He now moved with cool precision and absolute determination to set the army right and end the threat of civil war. On the night of September 30th, 1923, Black Reichswehr troops under the command of Major Bruckner seized 3 forts to the west of Berlin. Seeckt ordered regular forces to besiege them, and After 2 days, Bruckner surrendered. He was tried for high treason and actually sentenced to 10 years. The Black Reichswehr, which had been set up by Sekt himself under the cover name of Labor Commandos to provide secret reinforcements to the 100,000-man Reichswehr, was dissolved. Sekt nearly turned his attention to the threats of communist uprisings in Saxony. In Saxony, the socialist communist government was arrested by the local Reichswehr commander, and a Reich commissioner appointed to rule. In Hamburg and in the other areas, the communists were quickly and severely squelched. It now seemed to Berlin that the relatively easy suppression of the Bolshevists had robbed the conspirators of Bavaria of the pretext which they were really acting to save the Republic from communism, and that they would now recognize the authority of the national government. But it did not turn out that way. Bavaria remained defiant of Berlin. It was now under the dictatorial control of a triumvirate: Kahr, the state commissioner; General Otto von Lossow, commander of the Reichswehr in Bavaria; and Colonel Hans von Seisser, the head of the state police. Kahr refused to recognize President Ebert's proclamation of a state of emergency in Germany. He declined to carry out orders from Berlin. When the national government demanded the suppression of Hitler's newspaper, the Volksreicher Beobachten, because of its Belleric attacks on the Republic in general and on Sekt, Stresemann and Gessler in particular refused. A second order from Berlin to arrest 3 notorious leaders of some of the armed bands in Bavaria, Captain Heiss, Captain Eidhart, and Lieutenant Rosbach, was also ignored by Kahr. Sekt, his patience strained, ordered General von Lossow to suppress the Nazi newspaper and arrest the 3 Freikorps men. The general himself, a Bavarian and confused weak officer who had been taken in by Hitler's eloquence and Kahr's persuasiveness, hesitated to obey. On October 24th, Sekt sacked him and appointed General Kress von Kressenstein in his place. Kahr, however, would not take this kind of dictation from Berlin. He declared that Lossow would retain the command of the Reichswehr in Bavaria, and, defying not only Sekt but the Constitution, forced the officers and the men of the army to take a special oath of allegiance to the Bavarian government. Thus the Berlin was not only political but military rebellion, and General von Sekt was now determined to put down both. He issued a plain warning to the Bavarian triumvirate and to Hitler. But for the Nazi leader, it was too late to draw back. His rabid followers were demanding action. Lieutenant Wilhelm Bruckner, one of the SA commanders, urged him to strike back at once. "The day is coming," he warned, "when I won't be able to hold the men back. If nothing happens now, they'll run away from us." Hitler realized, too, that if Stresemann gained much more time and began to succeed in his endeavor to restore tranquility to the country, his own opportunity would be lost. He pleaded with Kahr and Lossow to march on Berlin before Berlin marched on Munich. But his suspicion grew that either the triumvirate was losing heart or that was planning a separatist coup without him for the purpose of detaching the Bavarian from the Reich. To this, Hitler, with his fanatical ideals of a strong nationalist unified Reich, was unalterably opposed. Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser were beginning to lose heart after Sekt's warning. They were not interested in a futile gesture that might destroy them. On November 6th, they informed the Kampfbund, of which Hitler was a leading political figure, they would no longer be hurried into precipitate action, and that they would alone decide when and how to act. This was a signal to Hitler, that he must seize the initiative himself. He did not possess the backing to carry out a push alone. He would have the support of the Bavarian state, the army, and the police. This was a lesson he learned in the beggarly Vienna days. Somehow, he would have to put Karl, Loso, and Caesar in a position where they would have to act with him, from which there would be no turning back. Boldness, even recklessness, was called for, and that Hitler now proved he had. He decided to kidnap the triumvirate and force them to use their power at his bidding. The idea at first proposed to Hitler by two refugees from Russia, Rosenberg and Schubert-Richter. The latter, who had ennobbed himself with his wife's name and calls himself Max Erwin. On November 4th, Germany's Memorial Day would be observed by a military parade in the heart of Munich, and it had been announced in the press that not only the popular Crown Prince Ruprecht, but Karl, Loso, and Caesar would take the salute of the troops from a stand in a narrow street leading from the Fedler Hall. I need water. Isn't it great? I can tell you this. I can tell when he gets weaker. I can tell when he gets weaker. He's just different. He can't even put a seatbelt on when he's weaker. Oh. Time to slaughter the water. Two considerations led Hitler to a rash decision. The first was that he suspected Karl might use the meeting to announce the proclamation of Bavarian independence and the restoration of Wittelsbach to the Bavarian throne. All day long on November 8th, Hitler tried in vain to see Karl, who put him off until the 9th. This only increased the Nazi leader's suspicions. He must forestall Karl. Also, and this was the second consideration, his latest meeting provided the opportunity, which had been missed on November 4th, the chance to rope in all three members of the triumvirate, and at the point of a pistol force them to join the Nazis in carrying out the revolution. Hitler decided to act at once. Plans for the November 10th mobilization were called off. The stormtroops were hastily alerted for duty at the big beer hall. About 8:45 on the evening of November 8th, 1923, after Karl had been speaking for half an hour to some 3,000 thirsty burghers seated at rough-hewn tables and quaffing their beer out of stone mugs in the Bavarian fashion, SA troops surrounded the beer hall, and Hitler pushed forward into the hall. While some of his men were mounting a machine gun on the entrance, Hitler jumped up on a table to attract some attention and fired a revolver shot toward the ceiling. Carr paused in his discourse. The audience turned around to see what was the cause of this disturbance. Hitler, with the help of Hess and of Urach Garf, the former butcher, amateur wrestler, and brawler, now the leader's bodyguard, made his way to the platform. A police major tried to stop him, but Hitler pointed his pistol at him and pushed on. Carr, according to one eyewitness, had now become pale and confused. He stepped back from the rostrum, and Hitler took his place. "The national revolution has begun!" Hitler shouted. "This building is occupied by 6,000 heavily armed men. No one may leave the hall. Unless there is immediate quiet, I shall have a machine gun posted in the gallery. The Bavarian and the Reich governments have been removed and the provisional national government formed. The barracks of the Reichswehr and police are occupied. The army and the police are marching on the city, and the swastika banner is flying." This last was false. It was a pure bluff. But in the confusion, no one knew for sure. Hitler's revolver was real. It had gone off. The stormtroopers with their rifles and machine guns were real. Hitler now ordered Carr, Lassow, and Seisser to follow him to a nearby private room off stage. Prodded by stormtroopers, the three highest officials of the Bavarian government did Hitler's bidding, while the crowd looked on in amazement. But with growing resentment, too, many businessmen still regarded Hitler as something of an upstart. One of them shouted to the police, "Don't be cowards! Shoot!" But the police, with their own chief so docile and the SA taking over, the hall did not budge. Hitler had arranged for a Nazi spy at police headquarters to telephone the police on duty at the beer hall, not to interfere, but merely to report. The crowd began to grow so sullen that Göring felt it necessary to step in to quiet them. "There is nothing to fear," he cried. "We have the friendliest of intentions. For that matter, you have no cause to grumble. You've got beer." And he informed them that in the next room a new government was being formed. It was at the point of Hitler's revolver. Once he had herded his prisoners into the adjoining room, Hitler told him, "No one leaves this room alive without my permission." He then informed them that they would all have key jobs, either in the Bavarian government or in the Reich government, which he was forming with Ludendorff. With Ludendorff? Early in the evening, Hitler dispatched Richter to fetch the renowned general who knew nothing of the Nazi conspiracy to the beer house at once. The three prisoners first refused to speak to Hitler. He continued to harass them. Each of them must join him in proclaiming the revolution and the new government. Each must take the post he, Hitler, assigned, or he has no right to exist. Carr was to be the regent of Bavaria, Lassow, minister of the National Army, Seisser, minister of the Reich Police. None of the three was impressed at the prospect of such high office. They did not answer. Their continued silence unnerved Hitler. Finally, he waved his gun at them. "I have 4 shots in my pistol. 3 for my collaborators if they abandon me. The last bullet for myself." Pointing the weapon to his forehead, he cried, "If I am not victorious by tomorrow afternoon, I shall be a dead man." Carr was not a very bright individual, but he had physical courage. "Herr Hitler," he answered, "you can have to shoot me or shoot me yourself. Whether I die or not is no matter. Seisser also spoke up. He reproached Hitler for breaking his word of honor, not to make a push against the police. Yes, I did, Hitler replied. Forgive me, but I had to do it for the sake of the fatherland. General von Lossow disdainfully maintained silence, but when Carr started to whisper to him, Hitler snapped, Halt! No talking without my permission! He was getting nowhere with his talk. Not one of the three men who held, who held the power of the Bavarian state in their hands had agreed to join him, even at pistol point. The push wasn't going according to his plan. Then Hitler acted on sudden impulse. Without a further word, he dashed back to the hall, mounted the tribune, faced the sudden crowd, and announced that the members of the triumvirate in the next room had joined him in forming a new national government. The Bavarian ministry, he shouted, is removed. The government of the November criminals and the Reich president are declared to be removed. A new national government will be named this very day here in Munich. A German national army will be formed immediately. I propose, until accounts have been finally settled with the November criminals, the direction of policy in the national government be taken over by me. Ludendorff will take over the leadership of the German National Army. The task of the provisional German national government is to organize the march on that sinful Babel Berlin and save the German people. Tomorrow we'll find either a national government in Germany or us dead. Not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, Hitler had told a masterful lie, and it worked. When the gathering heard that Carr, General von Lossow, and Police Chief von Seisser had joined Hitler, its mood abruptly changed. There were loud cheers, and the sound of them impressed the three men still locked and up in the little side room. Schumann Reichter now produced General Ludendorff as if out of a hat. The war hero was furious with Hitler for pulling such a complete surprise on him. And Ludendorff's timely arrival had saved Hitler. Overjoyed at his lucky break, he led the others back to the platform, where each made a brief speech and swore loyalty to each other and then to the new regime. The crowd leaped on chairs and tables in delirium of enthusiasm. Hitler beamed with joy. He had a childlike, frank expression of happiness that I shall never forget, an eminent historian who was president later declared. Again mounting the rostrum, Hitler spoke his final words at the gathering. I want now to fulfill the vow which I made to myself 5 years ago when I was a blind cripple in the military hospital. To know neither rest nor peace until the November criminals have been overthrown. Until on the ruins of the wretched Germany of today, there should have arisen once more a Germany of power and greatness, of freedom and splendor. This meeting began to break up. At the exits, Hess, aided by stormtroopers, detained a number of Bavarian cabinet members and other notables who were trying to slip out along with the throng. Hitler kept his eye on Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser. The news came out of a clash between the stormtroopers of one of the fighting leagues, the Bund Oberland, and regular troops at the Army Engineers Barracks. Hitler decided to drive to the scene and settle the matter personally, leaving the beer hall in charge of Ludendorff. This turned out to be a fatal error. Lossow was the first to slip away. He informed Ludendorff that he must hurry to his office at Army headquarters to give necessary orders. Hitler, in high spirits, returned to the beer hall to find that the birds had flown the coop. This was the first blow of the evening, and it stunned him. He had confidently expected to find his ministers busy at the new tasks, while Ludendorff and Lossow looked out plans for the march on Berlin. But almost nothing was being done. Not even Munich was being occupied by the revolutionary forces. Rome, at the head of a detachment of stormtroopers from another fighting league, the Reichskriegsflagge, had seized army headquarters at the War Ministry. But no other strategic centers were occupied, not even the telegraph office, over whose wires news of the coup went out to Berlin, and orders came back from General von Secht to the army in Bavaria. Though there were some defections among the junior officers and some of the troops whose sympathies were with Hitler and Rome, the higher officers, led by General von Danner, commander of the Munich garrison, not only were prepared to carry out Secht's command, but were bitterly resentful of the treatment meted out by General von Lossow. In the Army's code, a civilian who pointed a revolver at a general deserved to be smitten by an officer's sidearm. From headquarters at the 19th Infantry Barracks, where Lossow had joined Danner, messages went out to outlying garrisons to rush reinforcements to the city. By dawn, regular army troops had drawn a cordon around Romm's forces in the War Ministry. Before this action, Hitler and Ludendorff joined Romm and the ministry for a time to take stock of the situation. Romm was shocked to find that no one besides himself had taken military action and occupied the key centers. Hitler tried desperately to re-establish contact with Lossow, Kahr, and Seisser. Messengers were being dispatched to the 19th Infantry Barracks in the same name of Ludendorff, but they did not return. Pohner, the former Munich chief police, and now one of Hitler's supporters, was sent with Major Heuhelin and a band of the SS troopers to occupy police headquarters. They were promptly arrested there. And one of Gustav von Kahr, the head of the Bavarian government, after leaving the beer hall, he had quickly recovered his senses and courage. Not wishing to take any more chances on being made a prisoner of Hitler and his rowdies, Kahr moved the government to Regensburg. But not before he ordered placards posted throughout the Munich city carrying the following proclamation: The deception and perfidy of ambitious comrades have converted a demonstration in the interests of national reawakening into a sense of disgusting violence. The declarations extorted from myself, General von Lossow, and Colonel Seisser at the point of the revolver are null and void. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, as well as the Fighting Leagues Oberland and Reichsflagge, are dissolved. Von Kahr, General State Commissioner.